This is episode 20 of the Shame Proof Your Life podcast, the one where I talk about feeling helpless. I'm your host and life coach, Danita Bremer. Have you ever received a prompting that you ignored for a long time, like 17 years? This podcast is that for me. I'm telling my stories, I'm learning from my past, and I'm inviting you along for the ride because I know my story can help others. I'm not alone, and neither are you. Okay, I am recording this on Saturday afternoon before it comes out. So I'm only a couple days in the past, but school is over. My kids are home. My husband's home. And you might hear them in the background, but this is real life. And this podcast is a follow up on prompting. So here we go. Today, we're going to talk about feeling helpless. I was commenting in a Facebook group that I'm a part of, and another mom shared her experience about a difficult daughter and how she was feeling lots of shame about how the relationship was going and how things are turning out. And I commented, and in my comment, I asked her, and this was kind of an intuitive hit that I had to ask about this. Could your shame be actually covering up a different emotion like helpless? And that was a few days ago. And ever since then, I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about different emotions and how they are sometimes cover emotions or escalated emotions for other emotions. So, one really common one to think about is anger. Anger, it's possible for anger to just be anger, which usually means some kind of perceived injustice. But most of the time, I would say most of the time, or a large majority of the time, anger is actually an escalated emotion. Like we feel sad, but feeling sad has so little energy around it. And even feeling sad in and of itself feels a little bit helpless. And so instead of feeling sad, we want to feel something that has more energy and power behind it. And so we feel angry. So oftentimes we'll go from sad to like, well, I don't want to feel sad to anxious, and I don't want to feel anxious to angry or panic or something like that. So we would call the anger or the panic as like a cover emotion or an escalated emotion for something else that's going on. And part of the work that I do with my clients and frankly on myself is to try to peel back the layers of emotion to figure out what is kind of at the core of it. And I had never really thought about shame as a possible cover emotion or an escalated emotion until very recently. But as I think about it more, it makes a lot of sense because for me, in my experience, a lot of my shame, I think, is a cover for feeling helpless. Helpless feels so, I don't know, it feels so not full of energy, right? Feels so flat. And I kind of think we actually would rather feel shame than feel helpless. Shame is a form of blame. It is a self blame. And I just read this. I think it's in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that I think I've mentioned on the podcast before. If not, I've for sure mentioned in my social media. He said something about shame or blame being like there's a certain amount of power behind those two things. Even though shame definitely doesn't feel good, it feels like, well, if I can blame myself, then I can change it and then I can make it better. It's like a almost like an action of like, what can I do? And helpless is this emotion of like, there's nothing I can do. Right. And for so many of us, the leaning into that helpless feeling is like the worst thing ever. Like, I want to do something, I want to fix it, I want to get to the root of the problem, I want to shift things, I want to get away from it, like something. It's like something I can do. And helpless is like, there is nothing we can do. I think that's why a lot of people struggle with grief, because when we feel grief, there's nothing to do about the grief. There are things we can do to buffer from the grief, to kind of distract ourselves from the grief, but there's not a whole lot to do to address the grief other than feeling the grief. So, I'm going to give you actually several stories from my life that, as I reflected on the feeling of helplessness, I realized that it is a huge theme. The first story is the only one that doesn't involve my mother, which I found really fascinating. That as I looked back on experiences in my life where I felt helpless, almost every single one had my mom in it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But the first story is waiting at the bus stop, and the bus driver, who we knew didn't like us, and by us, I mean myself and two of my cousins who were living with my grandparents, and we went to school together. We knew he didn't like us and we didn't know why. And one day we're waiting at the end of the driveway, see the bus coming, and then he just waves at us and keeps going. And I'm not going to lie, I felt angry. I felt like, oh, why us? But I think what's underlying that is this feeling of helplessness, that no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to fix it or change it in any way. Like, we just have to deal with it. So that was the first one that I wanted to share. This two more stories involve cars, which now I'm like, well, no wonder I've had this kind of like fear or resistance to driving. I have a lot of stories in my life that involve cars or driving and helplessness. The first one I can remember, my mom actually didn't learn how to drive until she was 23. So I was 6 years old at the time. I have distinct memories of her studying for the driving test. And then after she got her driver's license, we owned this big late 1970s van, the kind that didn't have the windows on the side. It just had the two windows in the back and then the two windows, the driver side window and the passenger window. And we were driving down the hill from where I lived. So I lived up about 4 miles on a dirt road up this hill. And there were ditches on either side of the hill for the water runoff. And it was snowy, not a whole lot of snow that I can remember, but it must have been a little bit slippery in places because the van went into the ditch and it kind of just slid into the ditch. There wasn't any like damage to the van that I remember, but we couldn't get out. And so I don't particularly remember what we did. We weren't too far away from my grandmother's house. So we may have walked there. Of course, this was way before cell phones. And I just remember feeling so helpless and my mom feeling so helpless, like so like I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. This is my fault. So probably a lot of different emotions, but the main one I remember was helpless. And then several years later, I think I was in 5th or 6th grade, maybe 7th grade, but somewhere around that 6th grade time frame, my mom had a car and we were running late, and um, we went down, like, we had this driveway. I mean, it wasn't super long, but it was not super short either. And we got to the end of the driveway, and my mom said, "Hold on, something doesn't feel right." And she parked the car and got out, and we had a flat tire. And my dad was already at work, and she could not change the tire. Nobody, it was just me and my sister and my mom, and she couldn't change the tire. And I remember her crying and just feeling so frustrated. But I think again, underneath that was this helplessness. And me, I was 11 or 12 at the time, but me going like, well, if mom can't change the tire, there's nothing I'm going to be able to do to change the tire. And asking her, like, how can I help? And her just saying, there's nothing. There's another experience of my mom having a garden. This was when we still lived behind my grandparents' house. They had told her that she could have this certain area for her garden, and she really loved gardening. And one day, I think I came home from school and mom was in the garden and she was very sad. And I asked her what was wrong. And she said that she lost a diamond out of her ring. So my mom really loved rings and jewelry in general, but rings were mostly what she wore. She didn't wear a lot of necklaces or earrings. Occasionally she would. And I don't know what the story was with that particular ring, but she was very upset with losing the stone out of the ring. And she asked me to help her try to find it. But of course, it's a garden and there's dirt and plants and weeds and things all over the place. And the chances of us finding it were just so low. And I do remember feeling kind of like helpless in that moment. When my little sister was born, I was 11, almost 12 years old. And my dad woke us up in the middle of the night, "Wake up, get ready to go, mom's having the baby." And I remember the trip down the hill, these 4 miles on a dirt road and then another several miles on paved highway to get to the hospital, and mom, like, pushing herself into the corner of this truck that we were driving, and my other sister sitting kind of on my lap in between my knees, and her, like, in labor, having pain, trying to not let the baby come. And I just remember feeling like wide awake in the middle of the night, like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And really like seeing my mom in pain and not being able to do anything about it. Talk about helpless. But I think the experience that I had over and over and over again that I felt the most helpless was when my parents fought. They would scream and yell at each other. We could hear them like, physically. I mean, I don't think my dad ever meant to hurt my mom. I don't really know. Sometimes I look back on that time and think, as a kid, I never thought that my dad was trying to hurt my mom or my mom was trying to hurt my dad, that they would just fight. They would get into these fights. And I mean, I don't even know. I would always leave. Yeah, like that was the coping mechanism from a very young age, was go into a different room, go outside, something. And I remember one particular time taking my sisters outside and having like a blanket, and it was late at night and I was a little bit scared of like snakes and whatever else might be out there, but it was better than being inside and hearing our parents fight, and we could still hear them fight even from outside. And I just always felt so helpless. Like, these are two people that I love. I love my mom, I love my dad, and they are hurting each other so much. Now, as a child, I did not have those words, but now I can reflect back and think about it this way, that two people I love and they're hurting each other, and there's nothing I can do. That to me is the epiphany of helplessness. That I so desperately wanted to fix their relationship so that our family could be happy, and I just couldn't. Even as I got older, I maintained that kind of role of being the fixer. And when I was 12 or so years old and my mom was totally miserable and she looked at me and asked me, "Should I leave your dad?" Another moment of helplessness, because again, I love my mom and I want her to be happy and I don't want her to live this way. And I love my dad and I want him to be happy. And I want them together because of my interests. Like, I don't want to be in a family with just one parent or being shuffled back and forth. Like, we knew what that was like. There were kids that had divorced parents. And so what do you tell? What do you tell your parent? I want you to be happy, and so leave, except that I want me to be happy, so stay? I don't know. Total helplessness. The last story that I have mentioned before on the podcast is when I told my mom that a family member was sexually abusing me. And she just kind of looked at me and said, "Okay." And I realized, oh, she's not going to do anything about this. As I was reflecting on this idea of shame being a cover for helplessness, I realized that the first emotion in that situation was helpless. Then, and it probably didn't take too long, then, some more things probably came up like, okay, well, I'm going to have to do this myself. That is what I've mentioned before. But when the person or the people who are supposed to be your protectors and they're supposed to love you and support you find out that something terrible is happening to you and they don't do anything about it, it feels a little helpless. And as I was putting together the outline for this episode, I had this thought that helpless is the opposite of feeling empowered. And that is what I do. This is like what I have been able to do for myself through the tools and just my own natural coping mechanisms is finding ways to empower myself. I think that's why I was such a good student in school because there was always something for me to do in school. There was always a way for me to be better, a way for me to kind of get that validation. And it felt very empowering. Like, this is something I'm good at. This is something that I can control. And it's just the opposite of feeling helpless. And now I have this belief that no matter who you are or what you're doing, what your past was like, you actually are always empowered. You may not be able to see it yet, but somehow, some way, you have power. You have abilities to make decisions, to make choices. No matter what, we always have choices. Sometimes it just comes down to who am I going to be in this situation or what do I want to think about this? And for sure, I have had so many times when my choice, my power in that moment came from, well, Heavenly Father must have a reason for me to go through this and kind of turning it over to a greater power in that way. Sometimes that's all the power we have. But now I so rarely think that I am helpless or that there's nothing I can do. I just always know that there is something I can do. There is some action I can take, or there's a way for me to think or believe differently about the situation so that I don't feel helpless. That is kind of my message for you today is that consider as you think about the times when maybe you have felt shame, or maybe you feel shame today, that is it a cover emotion for helpless? And can you meet yourself? Can you go back to those memories of feeling helpless? And what would you tell that little girl or little boy inside of you who feels so helpless? Whatever you would tell them, that is the message you need to hear for yourself today to heal from that helplessness, that shame. Okay, that's enough for now, and so are you. Until next time, go be you and follow the spirit. Here's the thing with shame and helplessness, too, it always wants to hide. You never know who is struggling, but rating, reviewing, and sharing the podcast might help someone you had no idea needed it. I would also love to continue the conversation. Come find me on Instagram or Facebook at Danita Bremer Coaching.